jungle doesn't care about your beliefs. It doesn't care if you're a pacifist or a warrior, a volunteer or a draftee. In the Central Highlands of Vietnam, in February 1979, the triple canopy rainforest that stretched across Pleiku province swallowed men whole, indifferent to their faith, their politics, or their dreams of home. The heat was suffocating even in winter, a wet blanket of humidity that never lifted. And when the bullets started flying through that green darkness, when mortar rounds exploded in geysers of mud and shrapnel, the jungle certainly didn't care that one particular soldier had never wanted to hurt anyone at all. His name was Thomas William Bennett, but to the men of Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 14th Infantry, 4th Infantry Division, he was simply Doc. 21 years old, raised in the quiet streets of Morgantown, West Virginia, Tom Bennett carried no weapon into those killing fields. His hands, which had once played piano in church basements and turned pages of philosophy books in college libraries, now reached into shredded flesh and shattered bone. He was a conscientious objector, a young man whose deepest religious convictions forbade him from taking human life. Yet here he was, in one of the most dangerous places on earth, running toward the sound of gunfire when every instinct screamed to run away. The letters he wrote home told a story that most Americans never heard during the Vietnam War. They spoke of a young man torn between duty and conscience, between love of country and hatred of war. They captured the daily reality of a combat medic, the impossible burden of trying to save lives in the machinery of death, and they revealed something profound about the human capacity for courage. For in Thomas Bennett's brief 21 years, he would demonstrate that the refusal to kill and the willingness to die for others could be two faces of the same extraordinary valor. This is his story, not the sanitized version, not the propaganda, not the simplified narrative that war demands. This is the story told through his own words, through the letters and tape recordings he sent back to a small West Virginia town that seemed a universe away from the mud and blood of Southeast Asia. It's a story about faith tested in fire, about principles maintained under pressure, about the terrible weight of putting your own life on the line again and again to drag wounded men to safety while enemy machine guns sought your death. The Central Highlands in February 1969 were a cauldron of violence. The North Vietnamese army controlled vast swaths of territory, using the dense jungle and rugged mountains to stage ambushes and establish fortified positions. The 4th Infantry Division, scattered across Pleiku and Con Tum provinces, conducted endless reconnaissance missions and search and destroy operations, trying to find an enemy who melted into the landscape like morning mist. These were the border battles, the grinding. Campaigns fought far from cities and cameras, where young Americans stumbled through elephant grass and bamboo thickets, where they waded through rice paddies and climbed jungle-covered ridgelines, always knowing that the next step might trigger a mine. The next rustling of leaves might precede a burst of AK-47 fire. For Thomas Bennett, every patrol was a walking meditation on the paradox of his existence. He wore the uniform of warriors, but carried the cross of a healer. His fellow soldiers depended on him absolutely, loved him with the fierce devotion soldiers reserve for their medics, yet they knew he found the whole enterprise of war abhorrent. He ministered to men who had just killed, who would kill again, whose job was to locate enemy soldiers and destroy them. And he did it without judgment, without hesitation, with a dedication that would ultimately cost him everything. The story begins long before Vietnam, in a town where the Monongahela River winds through the Appalachian foothills, where West Virginia University sprawls across hills and valleys, where a boy growing up in the 1950s could still believe that America's wars were righteous and that following your conscience was the most American thing you could do. It begins with letters written home from training bases, from steaming jungle camps, from firefight positions, where the only light came from muzzle flashes and exploding grenades. It begins with the voice of a young man trying to make sense of an impossible situation, trying to honor God and country simultaneously when those two loyalties seemed locked in mortal combat. But it ends in 3 days of hell in the Chupar region, where Thomas Bennett would save at least 5 men on the first day, continue treating and evacuating wounded throughout a long night, and another day of sporadic contact, and then, on the 3rd day, make a decision that everyone told him was suicide. It ends with a young man who never fired a shot being posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, his sacrifice so profound that even President Richard Nixon, mired in the Vietnam quagmire, would recognize in Thomas Bennett something that transcended politics and strategy and the cold calculus of body counts. The letters survive. They're preserved in the West Virginia and Regional History Center at WVU, carefully archived alongside photographs and newspaper clippings, and the tape recordings he made when writing by hand in the jungle grew too difficult. His classmate and friend, Bonnie McKeown, would later weave them into a biography called Peaceful Patriot, a title that captures the beautiful contradiction at the heart of Tom Bennett's short life. These documents are time capsules, messages from a young man who knew he might not survive but desperately wanted people to understand why he went, what he felt, what he saw. They're not the letters of a saint. Tom Bennett was no plaster statue, no one-dimensional hero carved from propaganda. He was a college kid who partied too hard and let his grades slip. He was idealistic to the point of naivete about what his presence in Vietnam could accomplish. He got frustrated with the army bureaucracy, homesick for the mountains of West Virginia, scared in ways he only barely admitted in his private recordings. He was, in other words, entirely human, which makes what he did in those 3 days in February all the more remarkable. The Vietnam War produced many heroes, but few of them forced us to confront such fundamental questions about what heroism actually means. Can you be brave if you refuse to fight? Is it possible to serve your country while opposing its wars? What does it mean to love America enough to die for it, while hating what America is doing? Thomas Bennett's life and death don't provide easy answers to these questions. They're meant to make us uncomfortable, to challenge our assumptions about duty and conscience, war and peace, courage and cowardice. As we follow his journey from the quiet neighborhoods of Suncrest to the blood-soaked clearings of Pleiku Province, as we read his words and hear his voice captured on tape 50-plus years ago, we're not just learning about one remarkable young man. We're exploring the broader story of the Vietnam War, the Conscientious Objector movement, the experience of combat medics, the reality of jungle warfare, and the ways that war tests everything we think we believe about right and wrong. We're discovering that sometimes the most complex moral situations don't have heroes and villains, just flawed human beings trying to do their best in impossible circumstances. This is the story the letters tell. This is the story of Doc Bennett, the peaceful patriot who ran toward the sound of gunfire, who died trying to save one more life, who never carried a weapon but received his nation's highest military honor. This is a story about war and conscience, about faith and sacrifice, about the terrible price of trying to live your values when the whole world seems determined to make you compromise them. The jungle doesn't care about your beliefs, but history does, and the letters that survive remind us that sometimes the quietest voices, the most conflicted hearts, the young men who hate war but love their brothers in arms, sometimes those are the voices that need to be heard most clearly. So let's listen to what Thomas Bennett had to say. Let's read the letters he sent home. Let's try to understand what it meant to be Doc Bennett in the hell of Vietnam, and what his brief, brilliant, tragic life can teach us about courage, conscience, and the cost of staying true to yourself when everything is falling apart. The hills of Morgantown, West Virginia, roll and fold in waves of green, gentler cousins to the mountains that rise to the east. In the 1940s and 50s, this was still a town that knew everyone's business, where front doors stayed unlocked and children roamed the neighborhoods in packs, returning home only when the streetlights flickered on. The Monongahela River wound through town, its waters dark with the memory of coal and industry, while West Virginia University perched on the hills, a beacon of learning and promise in a region where higher education was still a luxury for many families. Thomas William Bennett was born into this world on April 7, 1947, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, part of that great surge of babies that would reshape American society. His father, William Thomas Doss, worked as a carpenter, a skilled tradesman in a town where such skills mattered. His mother, Bertha, balanced work and family as so many women did in that era, stretching every dollar, keeping the household running. Tom had two brothers, George and Jim, and together the Bennett boys were a fixture in the Suncrest neighborhood, that comfortable middle-class enclave where modest homes lined tree-shaded streets and children could still walk to school without anyone worrying too much. But Tom's childhood was shattered when he was only 5 years old. His father fell ill with Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the lymphatic system that in the 1950s was far more often fatal than treatable. The medical interventions that might have saved William Bennett simply didn't exist yet, and Tom watched his father waste away, watched the strong hands that had built cabinets and framed houses grow weak and thin. The death of a parent is always a wound, but for a 5-year-old boy, it's an earthquake that shifts the entire foundation of existence. One day your father is there, the anchor of your family, and then he's gone, and suddenly the world is a less certain place. Tom's mother, Bertha, did what countless widows have done throughout history. She carried on. She kept the family together. She worked. And eventually, she found someone else, a man who could help shoulder the burden of raising 3 boys alone. Kermit W. Gray entered the family's life, bringing with him not just stability, but a particular kind of influence that would shape Tom's development in crucial ways. Gray was a World War II veteran, a man who had served his country in that great crusade against fascism, who had seen combat and come home to build a peaceful life. He was patriotic in the deep, unquestioning way of his generation, believing that America, for all its flaws, was worth defending, that duty to country was sacred, that shirking that duty was shameful. The Bennett household became a blend of old loss and new structure. Kermit Gray stepped into the role of father with firmness and fairness, establishing rules and expectations, instilling in the boys a sense of discipline and purpose. But he also brought love and stability, creating a home where 3 boys who had lost their biological father could still grow up feeling secure and valued. The irony, of course, is that this man who would raise Tom to be a patriot, who would teach him that America was worth serving, would also watch that same son wrestle with the question of how you serve a country fighting a war you believe is wrong. Tom grew up as a typical Morgantown kid of the 50s, and that meant Little League baseball in the summer, Boy Scouts year-round, school clubs and church activities, and the casual freedoms of small-town childhood. He played in Suncrest Park, rode his bike through the neighborhoods, made friends easily with his open, curious personality. He was the kind of kid who asked a lot of questions, who wanted to understand not just how things worked, but why they worked that way, who would spend hours in the library reading about everything from ancient history to modern philosophy. The Boy Scouts were particularly important in shaping young Tom's character. In a program that emphasized duty, honor, and service, Tom thrived. He worked his way through the ranks, earning merit badges in first aid and citizenship, camping in the West Virginia mountains, learning knots and fire building and wilderness survival. The Scout Oath and Law, with their emphasis on being trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent, became a kind of moral framework for Tom. These weren't just words to recite at meetings. They were principles to live by, standards to meet, ideals to strive toward. But it was in church where the foundations of Tom's later convictions were truly laid. The Bennett family attended a Southern Baptist church in Morgantown, part of that great tradition of evangelical Protestantism that has shaped so much of American religious life. Southern Baptists in the 50s were theologically conservative, emphasizing personal salvation through faith in Jesus Christ, the authority of Scripture, and the importance of living a moral life according to biblical principles. They were also, like much of American Christianity in that era, deeply patriotic, seeing no contradiction between faith and flag, between serving God and serving country. For Tom, church wasn't just Sunday obligation, it became the center of his social and spiritual life. He sang in the choir, his voice lifting with others in those old hymns that promised peace in the midst of trouble, comfort in times of grief. He attended youth group meetings where teenagers gathered to discuss faith and life and all the questions that troubled adolescent hearts. He went to Bible studies, diving deep into Scripture, reading the Sermon on the Mount with its radical commandments to love your enemies and turn the other cheek, reading Paul's letters about spiritual warfare and putting on the armor of God, reading the Old Testament accounts of Israel's battles alongside the New Testament calls to peace. It was in these Bible studies, as Tom entered his teenage years, that the seeds of his later pacifism began to germinate. The Southern Baptist tradition wasn't pacifist. Most of the adults in his church would have considered conscientious objection to be cowardice dressed up in religious language. But Tom, reading Scripture with the intense focus of a true believer, began to be troubled by the gap between what Jesus taught and what the world practiced. Jesus said to love your enemies. The world said to destroy them. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." The world said, "Blessed are the strong." Jesus went to the cross without resistance. The world said that strength came from the willingness to fight and kill. These contradictions bothered Tom in ways they didn't seem to bother other people. He was the kid who, after a sermon about loving your neighbor, would ask the pastor whether that applied to communists. He was the teenager who, during a discussion about David slaying Goliath, would point out that Jesus never told anyone to slay anybody. His questions weren't hostile or meant to embarrass. They came from a genuine desire to understand, to reconcile what seemed like incompatible truths. How could you follow Jesus and go to war? How could you love your enemies while shooting at them? How could you claim that human life was sacred while training to take it? His brother George would later remember those late-night Bible study sessions with bemused affection. Tom and his friends from church would gather in someone's basement or living room, ostensibly to read Scripture and pray. But the sessions would often run for hours, turning into passionate debates about faith and morality and how a Christian should live in a fallen world. Tom would come home well past his curfew, and Kermit Gray would be waiting, arms crossed, ready to deliver consequences for breaking the rules. But Tom couldn't help himself. These questions mattered too much. Finding the answers seemed more important than getting enough sleep or staying out of trouble. There's a beautiful image that George preserved, one that captures something essential about Tom's character. Their bedroom on Junior Avenue was on the second floor, and Tom's window opened onto the porch roof. On those nights when the Bible study ran too late, when Tom knew that walking through the front door would mean facing an angry stepfather, he would scale the side of the house like a burglar, pull himself onto that porch roof and rap gently on George's window. George would let him in, and Tom would slip into bed. Another late night of theological wrestling complete. Think about that for a moment. Here was a kid, so committed to understanding his faith that he would literally sneak out of the house to attend Bible studies, then climb the wall to avoid punishment. This wasn't rebellion in the usual teenage sense. He wasn't sneaking out to drink beer or make out with his girlfriend. He was sneaking out for church, risking punishment to study scripture more deeply. It was the act of someone for whom faith wasn't abstract doctrine, but the central organizing principle of life, someone who believed that getting these questions right mattered more than anything else. Morgantown in the 50s and early 60s was still a relatively innocent place, insulated from many of the changes sweeping through American society. The civil rights movement was underway, but segregation had never been as entrenched in West Virginia as in the Deep South, and the state's relatively small black population meant that racial tensions, while present, didn't explode in the same way they did elsewhere. The Cold War shaped everyone's consciousness. Air raid drills at school, the constant background hum of nuclear anxiety, the sense that America and the Soviet Union stood locked in an existential struggle for the future of humanity. But for most kids in Morgantown, these were abstract concerns, background noise to the real business of growing up, making friends, playing sports, figuring out who you were going to be. Tom Bennett seemed destined for the professional class. He was bright, curious, a good student when he applied himself. His family could afford to send him to college, which in Morgantown meant West Virginia University, that massive institution that dominated the town both physically and economically. The path was clear. Graduate from Morgantown High School, head up the hill to WVU, earn a degree, maybe go on to graduate school, become a teacher or a social worker or a minister. It was the trajectory of upward mobility that defined the American dream in those years, the promise that hard work and education could lift you into a comfortable middle-class life. But history had other plans, because even as Tom Bennett was growing up in the peaceful hills of West Virginia, learning his scout oath and reading his Bible and playing Little League, a war was brewing 8,000 miles away in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. French Indochina was collapsing. The Geneva Accords would divide Vietnam. American advisors were being sent to prop up the South Vietnamese government. The dominoes, as President Eisenhower warned, were starting to fall, and America was determined to stop them. Tom's childhood in Morgantown, then, was lived in the shadow of wars past and wars to come. Kermit Gray's stories of World War II, the righteous war, the good fight against unambiguous evil, shaped Tom's sense that America stood for something worth defending. But the Bible studies where Tom wrestled with the Sermon on the Mount planted different seeds, a growing conviction that there might be a higher law than national interest, a more demanding loyalty than patriotism. These two influences, patriotism and pacifism, duty and conscience, would pull at Tom Bennett throughout his life, creating a tension that he would never fully resolve, a conflict that would ultimately define both his service and his sacrifice. The boy who grew up in Suncrest, who climbed onto the porch roof to avoid punishment for attending late-night Bible studies, who asked uncomfortable questions about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek, that boy was being shaped by forces he didn't fully understand. The death of his father taught him about loss and impermanence. Kermit Gray taught him about duty and honor. The Boy Scouts taught him about service and courage. The Southern Baptist Church taught him about faith and morality. And all of these influences, sometimes complementing each other and sometimes clashing, were forging a character that would be tested in ways that no one in peaceful Morgantown could have imagined. By the time Tom Bennett graduated from Morgantown High School in 1966 and headed up the hill to West Virginia University, Vietnam was no longer a distant abstraction. American combat troops were flooding into South Vietnam. The television news showed jungle firefights and burning villages and body bags coming home. The anti-war movement was stirring on college campuses. The country was starting to divide between hawks and doves, between those who believed America must stand firm against communist aggression and those who believed the war was immoral and unwinnable. Tom Bennett was about to enter that crucible. The boy from Suncrest was about to become a young man grappling with the hardest questions of his generation. And the letters he would write home, first from campus, then from training bases, finally from the jungles of Vietnam, would capture that struggle with an honesty and vulnerability that makes them remarkable historical documents. They're not polished or perfect. They're the raw thoughts of a young man trying to figure out how to be true to himself, true to his faith, true to his country, all at the same time, when those loyalties increasingly seemed to demand different things. The Morgantown childhood was ending. The letters and the legacy they would preserve were about to begin. If you wanted to be a young idealist in America in the mid-1960s, a college campus was the place to be. And if you wanted to be at a college campus where the ferment of change was just beginning to simmer, where traditional values still dominated, but new ideas were starting to percolate, West Virginia University in 1906 was a fascinating place to land. It wasn't Berkeley or Columbia or Wisconsin, those famous hotbeds of radical activism. It was still, in many ways, a conservative institution in a conservative state, where most students went to class in jackets and ties, where fraternities and sororities dominated social life, where the idea of seriously challenging authority seemed foreign and vaguely unpatriotic. But change was coming. In dorm rooms and student lounges, in campus coffee shops and late-night bull sessions, BVU students were starting to ask the questions that were dividing America. Why were we in Vietnam? What gave America the right to intervene in a civil war half a world away? Was this really about stopping communism, or were there darker motives at play? And perhaps most troubling for young men looking at their draft cards. What should you do if you believed the war was wrong, but your country was demanding you go fight it? Thomas Bennett arrived at WVU in the fall of 1966 as a freshman, moving from his family home on Junior Avenue to a dorm room somewhere on campus, making that transition from high school student to college man. He was 18 years old, lanky and energetic, with dark hair and an intense gaze that suggested he was always thinking about something serious. He wasn't an athlete, though he'd played sports in high school. He wasn't a party guy, though he certainly knew how to have fun. What defined Tom from the start was his engagement with ideas, his hunger for meaning, his need to understand not just what people believed, but why they believed it. He dove into campus life with characteristic energy, but not in the ways his stepfather might have hoped. Tom wasn't joining a fraternity, or trying out for the football team, or focusing on his studies with monastic discipline. Instead, he was organizing, discussing, debating, trying to build communities around the questions that obsessed him. How should young Christians respond to the war? What did faith demand in a time of national crisis? Was there a way to be patriotic while opposing government policy? During his freshman year at WVU, Tom Bennett did something remarkable. He founded the Campus Ecumenical Council, an organization that brought together students from different Christian denominations to discuss faith, social justice, and the moral questions of the day. This wasn't a social club or a fun activity. It was serious business, an attempt to create a space where Catholics and Protestants, evangelicals and mainline Christians could come together to wrestle with hard questions about what it meant to follow Jesus in turbulent times. The Campus Ecumenical Council meetings often ran late into the night, just like those high school Bible studies back home. Students would gather, sometimes a dozen, sometimes more, and the discussions would range across theology and politics, prayer and protest. They would read scripture together, pray together, and then debate what it all meant for their lives as American citizens in a country at war. Tom moderated many of these discussions, and those who knew him remember his ability to create space for different viewpoints, to let people express their honest convictions without judgment, while also pushing everyone to think more deeply, to question their assumptions, to consider whether they really believed what they claimed to believe. This was classic Tom Bennett. He wasn't interested in winning arguments. He was interested in getting at the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. He would challenge the conservative Christians who simply assumed that patriotism and Christianity were identical, who couldn't imagine questioning America's foreign policy. But he would also challenge the newly radicalized leftists who dismissed all religion as superstition and all believers as dupes. For Tom, faith wasn't the problem. Faith was the solution. If only you took it seriously enough to let it actually shape your life, rather than just providing a comfortable set of platitudes. Outside the Campus Ecumenical Council, Tom was becoming increasingly visible in WVU's small but growing anti-war movement. This wasn't yet 1968, when college campuses would explode in protest. This was 1906 and 1907, when opposing the war still felt risky, when you could be labeled unpatriotic or even traitorous for suggesting that maybe America shouldn't be in Vietnam. The majority of WVU students still supported the war, or at least weren't yet ready to actively oppose it. West Virginia was sending its sons to Vietnam in numbers that exceeded most other states relative to population, and when body bags came back to small towns across Appalachia, the response was usually grief mixed with pride, not anger at the government that had sent those boys to die. But Tom Bennett was asking questions. He was reading. He was learning about the history of Vietnam, about French colonialism and the First Indochina War, about Ho Chi Minh and the nationalist movement, about the corrupt South Vietnamese government the US was propping up. The more he learned, the more troubled he became. This didn't look like World War II. There was no Pearl Harbor to avenge, no Hitler to defeat, no clear moral justification that made the violence acceptable. This looked like empire, like America trying to control a part of the world where it had no business, sacrificing young American lives and countless Vietnamese lives in pursuit of a geopolitical strategy that seemed to have more to do with pride and Cold War paranoia than with any genuine threat to American security. Tom participated in teach-ins and discussions about the war. He attended protests, though WVU's protests were tame compared to what was happening on more radical campuses. He wrote letters to the Dominion News, the local paper, and to the student newspaper, expressing his opposition to the war in terms that tried to appeal to moral conscience rather than partisan politics. He was always careful to distinguish between supporting the troops, those young men serving in Vietnam, and supporting the war itself. He knew many of them, after all. They were classmates, friends, guys from Morgantown who had graduated high school a year or two ahead of him, and now were carrying MC through the jungle. Tom didn't judge them. He understood why they went. Many had no choice. But he was becoming increasingly convinced that the war itself was wrong, that it was causing immense suffering for no good purpose, that it needed to end. At the same time, and this is crucial for understanding Tom's later decision to serve, he was also becoming troubled by some elements of the anti-war movement. The crude anti-Americanism of some protesters bothered him, the contempt some activists showed for soldiers, calling them baby killers and murderers, struck him as deeply unfair. Tom believed the war was wrong, but he didn't believe America was evil. He loved his country, believed in its ideals, even if he thought it was making a terrible mistake. And he absolutely refused to condemn the soldiers who were doing what their government asked of them, who were following orders, who were serving their country as best they knew how. This put Tom in a complicated position. He was too anti-war for the conservatives, too patriotic for the radicals. He couldn't fully commit to either camp because both seemed to him to be missing something essential. The Hawks couldn't see that the war was unjust. The Doves couldn't see that service and sacrifice still mattered, even in an unjust war. Tom was trying to hold both truths simultaneously. The war is wrong, but America is good. This conflict is immoral, but the men fighting it deserve respect and support. We should resist this war, but we shouldn't abandon our country. It was an intellectually coherent position, but it was also emotionally exhausting, and it left Tom without a clear community. He had friends in the Campus Ecumenical Council, people who shared his faith-based opposition to the war. He had friends in the anti-war movement, people who were organizing protests and teach-ins. He had friends who were heading off to Vietnam, accepting their draft notices, or even enlisting, believing they were doing their duty. Tom tried to maintain connections with all these different groups, tried to be a bridge between people who increasingly saw each other as enemies. But bridges often get walked on from both directions, and Tom was feeling the strain. His academic work suffered. This is the part of the story that gets less attention, but it's important because it reveals Tom's priorities. He was at WVU on his parents' dime, with the expectation that he would get a good education, earn a degree, prepare for a career. But Tom was spending far more time on activism and religious organizing than on his studies. He would skip classes to attend meetings. He would stay up until 3 in the morning, debating theology and politics, then sleep through his 9 a.m. lecture. He would spend hours preparing materials for Campus Ecumenical Council discussions instead of writing papers for his classes. The result was predictable. Tom's grades slipped and slipped. And by the end of the fall semester of 1967, after just over a year at WVU, Tom Bennett found himself on academic probation. His GPA had fallen below the level required to maintain good standing. He was given a warning, put on notice that he needed to get his act together or face being kicked out of school. For Tom, this wasn't just an academic crisis, it was an existential one. Because in 1967, your student deferment was the only thing standing between you and the draft. As long as you were a full-time student in good standing at a college or university, the selective service wouldn't call your number. But if you flunked out, if you got kicked off campus, suddenly you were 1A, available for immediate induction. Suddenly you were just another name in the lottery, just another young man who might get called up to go to Vietnam. Tom Bennett knew all this. He knew the stakes, and yet he had to face a hard truth. He had essentially chosen activism over academics. He had chosen organizing the Campus Ecumenical Council and attending anti-war meetings over studying for exams and writing papers. Whether consciously or unconsciously, he had put himself in a position where losing his student deferment was a real possibility. Some of his friends wondered if this was self-sabotage, if some part of Tom actually wanted to force the issue, to move from theory to practice, to stop talking about his principles and start living them. Tom himself might not have been able to answer that question. Years later, looking at his letters and writings from this period, we can see as someone who was genuinely torn, genuinely uncertain about the right path forward. He valued education. He understood that staying in school was the smart, safe choice. He knew his family was sacrificing to keep him at WVU, and he felt guilty about letting them down. But he also felt called to something more urgent, more important than getting a degree. He felt called to bear witness, to stand up for what he believed, to be part of the resistance to a war he was convinced was wrong. The academic probation forced Tom to make a choice. He could buckle down, focus on his studies, bring his grades back up, maintain his deferment, and ride out his undergraduate years while the war raged on. Or he could continue prioritizing activism, accept that he might lose his deferment, and face whatever consequences came next. For a lot of young men facing this choice, the answer would have been obvious. Stay in school, keep your head down, don't be a hero, wait it out. But Tom Bennett wasn't wired that way. The idea of using college as a way to avoid dealing with the war, of hiding behind student deferment while other young men, often poorer, often less educated, went to fight and die in his place, that bothered him deeply. It felt cowardly. It felt like a betrayal of everything he believed about fairness and justice and shared sacrifice. If the war was wrong, he should be fighting to end it, not using his privilege to avoid its consequences. If men were dying in Vietnam, he had a responsibility to those men, even if that responsibility meant putting himself at risk. The letters Tom wrote during this period, preserved now in the WVU archives, show someone grappling with these questions with remarkable honesty. He wrote to his mother about his struggles at school, admitting that he was having trouble focusing, that he felt pulled in too many directions. He wrote to friends about his growing conviction that intellectual opposition to the war wasn't enough, that at some point you had to be willing to act on your beliefs, to face consequences, to make real sacrifices rather than just rhetorical ones. And he wrote, in a prayer that was later published in the Dominion News, words that revealed the depth of his spiritual crisis. O God, shake me from my apathy, from my wanderings of mind. Create in me discipline, concern, and love. Help me live, really live in spirit and in truth. Amen. This wasn't the prayer of someone coasting through life. This was the prayer of someone who felt called to something higher, but wasn't sure he had the strength to answer that call. This was the prayer of someone who recognized his own failings, his tendency toward distraction and avoidance, his difficulty committing fully to anything. Tom Bennett saw himself clearly, saw both his potential for courage and his capacity for cowardice, and he was begging God to make him into the person he wanted to be. The spring semester of 1968 arrived, and with it came the certainty that Tom wouldn't be able to bring his grades up enough to continue at WVU. He was going to lose his student deferment, he was going to have to face the draft, and suddenly all those theoretical discussions about conscience and duty and the right way to respond to an unjust war became intensely practical, immediately urgent. What would Tom Bennett do when his draft notice arrived? He had options. He could refuse induction entirely, declare himself a conscientious objector who wouldn't assist the military in any way, and accept the legal consequences, which could include prison time. This was the route some of the most committed pacifists chose, and while Tom admired their courage, he wasn't sure he could follow them. It felt too much like abandoning the country he loved, like standing on the sidelines while others suffered. He could flee to Canada, joining the thousands of draft resistors who crossed the northern border to avoid service. This was practical, effective, and increasingly common. But again, it felt like running away, like using his privilege and his passport to escape consequences that poor kids and black kids and working class kids couldn't escape. Tom had resources. He had a college education, even if incomplete. He had a family that could support him. Using those advantages to dodge the draft while others had to serve felt wrong to him at a gut level. Or he could do something that would seem, to many people on both sides of the anti-war debate, completely insane. He could enlist, not as a regular soldier, but as a conscientious objector willing to serve. The 1AO classification allowed men whose religious beliefs forbade them from killing to serve in the military in non-combatant roles, usually as medics. They would wear the uniform. They would deploy to war zones. They would face all the same dangers as combat troops, but they wouldn't carry weapons. They would save lives instead of taking them. This was the path that Thomas Bennett chose. It was, in its way, the most difficult path available. It required him to put himself at enormous risk while gaining nothing for himself. It satisfied neither the hawks, who saw conscientious objection as cowardice, nor the doves, who saw any cooperation with the military as complicity in war crimes. It meant going to Vietnam, going to the war he opposed, going to serve alongside men whose mission was to kill enemy soldiers, while maintaining his own pacifist convictions. It was a walk across a tightrope without a net, an attempt to honor all his conflicting loyalties simultaneously. But it was also deeply consistent with everything Tom Bennett believed about himself and his responsibilities. He believed the war was wrong, but he also believed he couldn't ask others to bear burdens he refused to share. He believed killing was wrong, but he also believed that healing and saving lives was not just permissible but morally required. He believed in America, even when America was making terrible mistakes, and he believed that sometimes loving your country meant serving it in ways that challenged its worst impulses, while still accepting your share of the sacrifice. So Tom Bennett went to the draft board and declared his conscience. He registered as a conscientious objector, willing to serve, based on his deeply held religious convictions as a Christian who took the commandments of Jesus seriously. He knew this would put him in the tiny minority of conscientious objectors who actually went to Vietnam. Most 1AO served stateside, working in hospitals or serving in support roles far from combat. But Tom also knew that if he was going to do this, if he was going to put on the uniform while maintaining his pacifist principles, he needed to go all the way. He needed to be where the dying was happening, where the need for medics was greatest, where his principles would be tested most severely. The Army accepted his application. In the spring of 1968, Thomas Bennett received his orders to report for basic training. He would become a medic. He would learn to save lives in the machinery of death. He would carry his conscience and his medical kit to Vietnam. And he would write letters home that would try to explain to his family, his friends, and perhaps most of all to himself, how he was going to survive the next year with his soul intact. The making of his conscience was complete. Now came the testing of it. Fort Sam Houston sprawls across more than 3,000 acres on the northeast side of San Antonio, Texas, a massive installation that has been training American military personnel since '88. In the summer of 1968, when Thomas Bennett arrived there for combat medic training, Fort Sam was processing thousands of young men through its medical education and training campus, trying to create a supply of medics adequate to the voracious demands of Vietnam. Every week, hundreds of soldiers would graduate and ship out to Southeast Asia. Every week, hundreds more would arrive to take their place, beginning the 10-week crash course that would transform them from civilians into combat medics. Tom Bennett had already completed basic training, that initial crucible that all soldiers must endure. The weeks of physical conditioning, weapons training, military drill, and psychological conditioning designed to break down civilian identity and rebuild military discipline. But Tom's basic training had been different in one crucial respect. He hadn't trained with weapons. As a registered conscientious objector willing to serve, he was exempted from weapons training, a source of both relief and anxiety. Relief, because he wouldn't have to violate his principles by learning to kill. Anxiety, because he knew this marked him as different, potentially making him a target for harassment from drill sergeants and fellow trainees who saw conscientious objection as cowardice. By his own account in letters home, basic training had been manageable but not easy. Some soldiers gave him grief about his status. Some questioned why he was even in the army if he wouldn't carry a gun. But Tom had held firm, explaining his position calmly and repeatedly, trying to make people understand that his refusal to kill didn't mean he was refusing to serve. He was serving. He was just going to serve differently, as a medic, as a healer. Most guys, once they understood that Tom wasn't trying to get out of anything, that he was actually volunteering to go to Vietnam as a medic, a job with one of the highest casualty rates in the infantry, they backed off. Some even respected him for it. Fort Sam Houston was where the real training began. The combat medic course in 1968 was intensive and practical, designed to give soldiers the maximum amount of life-saving knowledge in the minimum amount of time. The curriculum started with the basics: anatomy and physiology, how the human body works, what happens when it's damaged. Tom and his fellow trainees learned about the circulatory system, the respiratory system, the major organs, and how to recognize when they were failing. They learned medical terminology, that specialized language that allows healthcare providers to communicate precisely and quickly. Then came the practical skills. Tom learned to take vital signs, to assess a patient's condition quickly under pressure. He learned to start IVs, threading those crucial lines into veins that could pump life-saving fluids and medications into wounded men. He learned to draw blood, even though, as he confessed in one letter home, The sight of blood made him queasy. He watched medical films showing horrific battlefield injuries, training himself to look past the gore to see the medical problem that needed solving, fighting back nausea as he watched footage of men with their limbs blown off, their guts spilling out, their faces shredded by shrapnel. The army taught its medics to prioritize in combat situations. When you're dealing with multiple casualties, you can't help everyone equally. You have to make brutal triage decisions about who to treat first, who can wait, who is too far gone to save. Tom learned the cold calculus of battlefield medicine. Treat the ones you can save, do what you can for the ones you probably can't, and don't waste time on the ones who are already dead. It went against every instinct, every ounce of compassion in him, but he forced himself to understand the logic. If you spend 10 minutes trying to save one man who's going to die anyway, 3 other men who could have been saved will bleed out. Better to save 3 than to lose 4 because you couldn't accept that one was already gone. The medic's bag, the aid bag that would become Tom's constant companion in Vietnam, was packed with carefully selected supplies, battle dressings, those large bandages designed to cover the massive wounds caused by modern weapons, rolls of gauze for packing wounds, tourniquets for stopping arterial bleeding, morphine syrettes, those single-use auto-injectors that could deliver pain relief to wounded men, plasma and IV fluids, scissors, forceps, tape, and, crucially, knowledge about how to use all of it under the worst possible conditions, in the dark, in the rain, under fire, with hands that might be shaking from adrenaline or fear. Tom also learned the daily health maintenance duties that would occupy much of his time in Vietnam. Combat medics weren't just there for the dramatic moments of treating battlefield casualties. They were responsible for keeping soldiers healthy in a hostile environment where disease could kill as readily as enemy bullets. Tom learned about malaria prevention, making sure soldiers took their pills, used their insect repellent, slept under mosquito netting. He learned about immersion foot, that painful condition caused by keeping your feet wet for days on end, and about the importance of getting soldiers to change their socks and dry their feet whenever possible. He learned about heat injuries, about the dozens of ways that the tropical climate could incapacitate soldiers who didn't take care of themselves. He learned, in short, to mother hen his troops, to nag them about things that seemed minor but could become life-threatening. Button your shirt, roll down your sleeves, take your malaria pills, change your socks, drink more water. Don't drink that water from the stream without purifying it first. It was unglamorous work, this constant hectoring of soldiers to take basic care of themselves. But Tom came to understand that it was just as important as being able to treat gunshot wounds. If he could keep his soldiers healthy, keep them from getting malaria or dysentery or heat stroke, that was lives saved just as surely as pulling them out of the line of fire. But it was the trauma training that was most intense, most crucial, most terrifying. Tom and the other trainees practiced on sophisticated dummies that could simulate different types of injuries. They learned to recognize and treat sucking chest wounds, where a bullet or shrapnel had penetrated the chest cavity and was allowing air to collapse the lung. They learned emergency cricothyroidotomy, cutting a hole in someone's throat to create an emergency airway when the normal passage was blocked. They learned to pack abdominal wounds where intestines were exposed. They learned to splint fractures, to bandage burns, to treat shock. And they practiced. They practiced until the procedures became automatic, until they could do them in the dark, until they could do them while exhausted, until they could do them while some drill instructor was screaming in their ear and firecrackers were going off to simulate the chaos of combat. Because the army knew that in real combat, when the adrenaline was flooding your system and bullets were snapping past your head, and the man screaming for Doc was someone you'd eaten breakfast with that morning, you wouldn't have time to think. You'd have to act on training, on muscle memory, on procedures practiced so many times that your hands knew what to do, even when your brain was overwhelmed. Tom's letters home from Fort Sam Houston reveals someone who was both impressed by the training and deeply troubled by its implications. He appreciated the professionalism of his instructors, the way they were giving him real knowledge that could save lives. He was proud of mastering difficult skills, of being able to start an IV on the first try, of learning to bandage wounds quickly and effectively. But he was also confronting, perhaps for the first time, the full horror of what he was preparing for. The medical films didn't show clean television deaths. They showed men screaming, men missing limbs, men with their faces destroyed, men dying in agony despite everything their medics did for them. In one letter that has survived in the archives, Tom described watching a training film about battlefield injuries and having to leave the room to vomit. But then he went back in, forced himself to watch, forced himself to get used to the sight of blood and torn flesh, because he knew that if he couldn't handle it in training, he certainly wouldn't be able to handle it in combat when real soldiers were depending on him. This was Tom's way: acknowledge the fear, acknowledge the revulsion, then push through it anyway, because the mission was too important to let personal squeamishness get in the way. He also wrote about the contradiction he was living. He was being trained by the army, fed by the army, paid by the army. All in preparation for going to Vietnam to support American soldiers fighting a war he believed was wrong. Was he complicit in the war by serving as a medic? Was saving American soldiers the same as helping America prosecute an unjust war? These questions tortured Tom, and he wrote about them with painful honesty. He didn't have good answers. He just knew that he couldn't let American soldiers die for lack of medical care, even if he wished they weren't in Vietnam in the first place. During his time at Fort Sam Houston, Tom also connected with other conscientious objectors in training. There weren't many. Most COs who were willing to serve ended up in support roles far from combat, working in hospitals or administrative jobs where they wouldn't have to directly participate in the violence. But a few, like Tom, had requested combat medic training, knowing they would be sent to Vietnam, believing that the non-combatant willing to share the danger was making a different kind of witness than the non-combatant who stayed safely behind the lines. These men became a support network for each other, a small community of people who understood the peculiar position they were in. They weren't pacifists in the pure sense. They were willing to put on the uniform, follow military discipline, deploy to a war zone. But they also weren't regular soldiers. They had drawn a line, said there were some things they wouldn't do, no matter what orders they received. It was a precarious position, always vulnerable to accusations of cowardice from one direction and accusations of complicity from the other. But knowing there were others in the same position helped. It made Tom feel less alone. Tom graduated from the combat medic course in late 1968. He had passed all the tests, mastered all the required skills, earned his right to wear the medic's caduceus symbol. He was officially qualified to serve as a combat medic in the United States Army. His orders came through. He was being assigned to the 4th Infantry Division in Vietnam, to Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 14th Infantry, the Golden Dragons. He would have a few weeks of leave before shipping out, time to go home to Morgantown, to see his family, to prepare himself mentally and spiritually for what was coming. But first, Tom sat down and wrote a series of letters to his mother, trying to prepare her for the possibility that he might not come back. Letters to friends, trying to explain why he was choosing to go to Vietnam when he had moral objections to the war. And one particular letter that stands out, a letter to President Richard Nixon, who had just been elected, promising to end the war. In that letter, Tom explained his position clearly and without apology. He was opposed to the Vietnam War, believed it was unjust and immoral. He was going to Vietnam only because he felt a duty to serve his country and a responsibility to American soldiers who would need medical care. But he wanted Nixon to know that men like him existed, men who would serve while still believing the war was wrong, and that the President had a moral obligation to end this war as quickly as possible, to stop sending young Americans to die for a cause that didn't justify their sacrifice. It was a remarkable letter, polite but firm, patriotic but critical, the work of someone who refused to accept the binary choice between supporting the war uncritically or abandoning his country entirely. Tom was carving out a third position, one that acknowledged the complexity of duty and conscience, one that tried to honor multiple loyalties simultaneously, even when they seemed to contradict each other. And then, in January 1969, Private First Class Thomas William Bennett boarded a plane for Vietnam. He carried his medic's bag, packed according to Army specifications. He carried letters from home, photographs of family, a Bible. He carried his training, those 10 weeks of intensive instruction that he hoped would be enough to keep himself and his soldiers alive. And he carried his conscience, that internal compass that had guided him to this moment, that would continue to guide him through the challenges ahead. The flight to Vietnam was long, stopping for refueling in Hawaii, then continuing across the Pacific to land at Tan Son Nhut Air Base near Saigon. From there, Tom would be transported to the Central Highlands, to the 4th Infantry Division's area of operations around Pleiku. He would meet the men of Bravo Company, the soldiers whose lives would depend on his skill, his courage, and his willingness to run toward danger. When every instinct screamed to run away, Tom Bennett, the college student, the Campus Ecumenical Council founder, the anti-war protester, was becoming Doc Bennett, combat medic. The letters he would write home from Vietnam would be different from the letters he'd written from Fort Sam Houston. They would be raw, more immediate, more honest about fear and exhaustion and the weight of responsibility for other men's lives. They would capture what it was like to try to live your principles in hell, to maintain your faith when you're surrounded by death, to stay true to yourself when the whole world seems designed to crush that self out of existence. The training was over. The real test was about to begin. The Central Highlands of Vietnam are beautiful in a way that's hard to reconcile with the violence they've witnessed. These are old mountains, worn down by time into rolling, forested ridges, cut by rivers and streams. The jungle grows in layers, triple canopy rainforest where sunlight barely penetrates to the forest floor, creating a twilight world of shadows and humidity even at midday. Bamboo thickets so dense you can barely push through them. Elephant grass tall enough to hide a man or conceal an entire enemy unit. The terrain is rugged, exhausting, perfect for ambush and terrible for the kind of large-scale mechanized warfare the American military preferred. In January 1969, this was one of the deadliest regions in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Army controlled vast sections of the Central Highlands, using them as staging areas for infiltration into the more populated lowlands. The 4th Infantry Division, stretched thin across Pleiku and Kon Tum provinces, conducted constant patrols and sweeps, trying to locate enemy base camps, interdict supply, lines, prevent the NVA from massing for attacks on South Vietnamese cities. It was grinding, dangerous work that rarely made headlines back home, but consumed the lives and blood of thousands of American soldiers. Tom Bennett arrived in this landscape in early January 1969, coming in through the massive American air base at Pleiku, that sprawling complex of runways and helicopters and supply depots that served as the logistical hub for American operations in the region. He was processed through reception, given his unit assignment, and then shuttled out to join Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 14th Infantry, somewhere in the field. His first impressions of Vietnam, preserved in a tape recording he made on January 24th and sent home to Morgantown, reveal someone trying to maintain optimism while being overwhelmed by strangeness. The heat hit you first, that wet blanket tropical heat that soaked through your uniform and left you perpetually damp. The smell was different from anything in West Virginia. A mixture of vegetation and rot, cooking fires and diesel fuel, the pervasive, unavoidable smell of a country where modern war was being fought in ancient jungles. The sounds were different too. The constant thump of helicopter rotors, the crack of distant gunfire, the exotic calls of birds and insects that belonged to an entirely different world from the familiar songbirds of Appalachia. In that January 24th tape, Tom's voice is cheerful, trying to reassure his family that he's doing okay. "Somewhere in the great, noble land of South Vietnam," he begins, adding with characteristic dry humor, "At least I hope it's south. I'm pretty sure it is." He talks about his first days with Bravo Company, about trying to learn everyone's names, about the challenge of being the new guy, the FNG, fucking new guy in Vietnam parlance, though Tom would never use that language with his family. He mentions that he's adjusting, that the guys seem okay, that he thinks he's going to be able to do the job. But underlying the cheerful tone is a thread of anxiety. Tom talks about the condition of soldiers' feet, about how they keep their boots on for days at a time in the field, leading to immersion foot and infections. He talks about soldiers not buttoning their shirts properly, not rolling down their sleeves, leaving themselves vulnerable to insect-borne diseases. Hopefully tonight we'll be able to straighten that out just a little bit, have some cooperation to get the sleeves down, because I'd like to not lose too many guys to malaria, he says. Already, just weeks into his deployment, Tom was slipping into the mother-hen role that combat medics must adopt, nagging soldiers to take care of themselves in ways that could save their lives. The men of Bravo Company quickly nicknamed him Doc, as soldiers always call their medics. It's a term of affection and respect, acknowledging both the medical knowledge and the courage required to do the job. Doc was the one you screamed for when you got hit. Doc was the one who would come running when everyone else was taking cover. Doc was the one whose face you wanted to see when you were bleeding out in the jungle, because if Doc could get to you, maybe you'd make it home. Tom threw himself into the work of being Doc with characteristic intensity. He checked on soldiers constantly, making sure they were taking their malaria pills, inspecting feet for signs of immersion foot, treating the dozens of minor ailments that afflicted men living rough in the jungle. He dealt with heat rashes, insect bites, upset stomachs from bad water, cuts and scratches that could turn septic in the tropical climate. He became the company expert on preventive medicine, constantly preaching about the importance of staying hydrated, changing socks, sleeping under mosquito nets. The soldiers initially weren't sure what to make of this skinny kid from West Virginia who was so intense about foot care and who wouldn't carry a rifle. Some tested him, trying to get a rise, asking pointed questions about his conscientious objector status, but Tom handled it with patience and honesty. Yes, he was a CO. No, he wouldn't carry a weapon. Yes, he was opposed to the war. No, that didn't mean he was refusing to do his job or that he'd let them down if things got hot. He was there to save lives, period. If they got hurt, he'd come get them, no matter what. The men started to believe him, and more than that, they started to respect him. Because Tom didn't just talk about being a medic, he proved it every day. When the company went on patrol, humping through the jungle in single file, sweat-soaked and exhausted, Tom carried everything the other soldiers carried, plus his heavy medical bag, plus extra supplies in case of mass casualties. When they dug in at night, establishing perimeter security, Tom would make rounds, checking on everyone, making sure they had what they needed. When someone got sick, Tom would sit with them, monitoring their condition, trying to make them comfortable in deeply uncomfortable circumstances. The letters and tapes Tom sent home from these first weeks in Vietnam capture someone who was trying very hard to stay positive, but was also being confronted with the reality of what he'd signed up for. The patrols were grueling, slogging through jungle that fought back against every step, scrambling up muddy hills, wading through streams, always watching for the telltale signs of booby traps or ambush sites. The nights were long and tense, 2 hours on watch, 4 hours trying to sleep in a hole in the ground while rain poured down and the jungle made its strange sounds. The food was terrible, sea rations that all tasted vaguely the same, heated over little fuel tabs when you could risk the smoke, eaten cold when you couldn't. But what was hardest was the constant tension, the knowledge that at any moment everything could explode into violence. The 4th Infantry Division was in heavy contact with North Vietnamese regulars. This wasn't fighting scattered Viet Cong guerrillas. This was fighting well-trained, well-equipped NVA soldiers who knew the terrain intimately and were willing to fight to the death. Ambushes could happen anywhere, any time. The jungle could erupt in a storm of gunfire and explosions without warning. Men could be walking and talking one moment and dead the next. Tom wrote about this fear with remarkable honesty. In one letter home, he admitted that he was scared much of the time, that the not knowing was worse than actual combat would be, that waiting for something to happen was more exhausting than dealing with the chaos when it finally did happen. But he also wrote about finding resources within himself that he hadn't known existed, about discovering that he could function under pressure, that his training was solid, that when the moment came he would be able to do what needed doing. He also wrote about his faith, and here the letters become particularly moving. Tom had always been religious, but combat was testing his theology in new ways. How do you maintain belief in a loving God when you're surrounded by such senseless suffering? How do you pray when the prayers you most want to offer, prayers for peace, for an end to the war, seem to go unanswered? How do you trust in divine providence when good men, kind men, men with families waiting for them, die in random, meaningless ways? Tom didn't have easy answers to these questions. His letters show someone wrestling with doubt, with anger at God, with the sense that maybe faith was just a comforting delusion that couldn't survive contact with real evil. But they also show someone who kept praying anyway, who kept reading his Bible even when it seemed to make no sense, who kept trying to find meaning and purpose in the chaos. Tom's faith was tested in Vietnam, but it didn't break. It evolved, became deeper and more nuanced, lost some of its naive certainties, but gained a kind of hard-won wisdom. By early February 1969, Tom Bennett had been in country for about 5 weeks. He had survived his F&G period. He had earned the trust and respect of the men in Bravo Company. He had treated minor injuries and illnesses, had kept his soldiers as healthy as the conditions allowed. He had been on numerous patrols through some of the most dangerous terrain in Vietnam. He had heard gunfire in the distance, but hadn't yet been in direct contact with the enemy. But that was about to change, because on February 9th, 1969, Bravo Company would walk into a buzzsaw. In his last tape recording home, made just days before the battle that would define his legacy, Tom spoke with what sounds like premonition. He told his mother not to worry about him. He said that for some reason he felt that they couldn't hurt him, that he was going to be okay. He talked about feeling confident, more sure of himself than he'd ever been, at ease with who he was and what he was doing. Despite all these things, he said, I can say in all honesty that I've never been more confident, more sure of myself and more at ease with myself. That I like. And if this has to be, and I have to be here, I'm glad I'm a medic. It's heartbreaking to hear that optimism now, knowing what was coming. But it also reveals something essential about Tom Bennett's character. He had found his purpose. Despite all his doubts about the war, despite all his moral qualms about serving in the military, despite the fear and discomfort and homesickness, he had discovered that being Doc, being the guy who saved lives, being the one his soldiers depended on, that gave his life meaning and direction in a way nothing else ever had. He was ready. He just didn't know what he was ready for. The reconnaissance enforced mission was supposed to be routine, if anything in Vietnam could be called routine. Bravo Company's 2nd Platoon was moving through the dense jungle of the Chupa region, trying to link up with another element that had run into trouble. The North Vietnamese were known to be in the area, but intelligence was always sketchy in the Central Highlands. You never really knew where the enemy was until they opened fire. And on the morning of February 9th, 1969, they opened fire with everything they had. The ambush was textbook perfect from the enemy's perspective. The NVA had chosen their ground carefully, selecting a position that gave them clear fields of fire while using the jungle for concealment. They had fortified their positions, digging in behind logs and earthworks, preparing interlocking fields of fire that would catch the Americans in a deadly crossfire, and they had waited with the patience that comes from fighting on your home ground, knowing the Americans would eventually walk into the trap. When the shooting started, it wasn't the scattered crack of rifle fire that marked most contacts. This was a concentrated storm of violence, small arms, automatic weapons, mortars, rockets, all unleashed simultaneously. The point element of the platoon, the soldiers at the front of the formation, took the brunt of it. 3 men went down immediately, torn apart by the initial barrage. The rest of the platoon hit the ground, returning fire, trying to locate the enemy positions through the smoke and vegetation, calling for artillery support, for air support, for anything that could help them survive the next few minutes. And Thomas Bennett, who had been walking with the main body of the platoon when the shooting started, who had dropped his medical bag and thrown himself flat like everyone else, who had felt that first surge of pure terror that combat brings, heard the screams. "Medic! Medic, Doc, we need you." The wounded men were in the kill zone, that 50-meter stretch of ground that the enemy's weapons were covering. Getting to them meant leaving whatever cover the jungle provided. It meant running through a hail of bullets, exposing yourself completely, making yourself a target. Every instinct, every cell in your body, every survival mechanism that evolution has built into the human animal screams at you to stay down, stay hidden, stay alive. Running toward the sound of gunfire is insane. It goes against everything that nature has programmed into us. But Tom Bennett was a medic, and medics run toward the gunfire. He grabbed his aid bag and moved. Not thinking, not calculating the odds, not considering that he might die in the next 10 seconds. Just moving, because that's what Doc did. That's what his soldiers needed. That's what his training had prepared him for. He sprinted toward the first wounded man, bullets snapping through the air around him, kicked up dirt geysers following his path. He reached the soldier, a kid maybe 19 years old with half his leg blown away, screaming and thrashing. Tom threw himself down next to him, hands already moving, pulling out a tourniquet, getting it around the shattered limb above the wound, twisting it tight to stop the arterial bleeding that would kill the kid in minutes if Tom couldn't control it. "You're gonna be okay?" Tom shouted over the gunfire, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding his system. "I got you. You're gonna make it." He got the tourniquet secured, slapped a pressure dressing over the wound, shot the kid up with morphine to take the edge off the agony. Then he was moving again, grabbing the soldier under the arms, dragging him backward toward cover, bullets hitting the ground where they'd been seconds before, the wounded man's blood soaking into Tom's uniform as he pulled him to safety. 1 down, 4 more to go. Tom went back into the kill zone. Again and again, each time expecting the bullet that would end his life, each time somehow making it through. He reached a soldier with a sucking chest wound, could hear the air whistling through the hole in the man's torso. Tom sealed the wound with plastic wrap and tape from his aid bag, creating a one-way valve that would let air out but not in, preventing the lung from collapsing completely. He got an IV started, pumping plasma into the soldier's veins to replace lost blood volume. Then he dragged that man back too, his back and shoulders screaming from the effort, sweat and blood and mud mixing on his uniform. The firefight was still raging. M16s and M60 machine guns from the American side answered AK-47s and RPD machine guns from the Vietnamese side. Mortars were falling, grenades exploding. The jungle was being torn apart by the volume of fire. But through it all, Tom Bennett kept moving. He reached a soldier with shrapnel wounds across his back and legs, patched him up as best he could, got him evacuated. He reached another with a bullet through the shoulder, bone shattered, arm useless. More morphine, more bandages, more dragging wounded men through the mud and blood and chaos, back to relative safety. His platoon sergeant, watching Doc Bennett risk his life over and over, knowing that medics weren't supposed to be in the kill zone this long, that Tom was pushing his luck beyond any reasonable limit, made a decision right there in the middle of the firefight. If they survived this, if Doc Bennett lived through this day, he was putting him in for the Silver Star. Because what Tom was doing went beyond duty, beyond training, beyond anything the army could reasonably expect from any soldier, let alone from a conscientious objector who'd never wanted to be in Vietnam in the first place. By the time the firefight died down, as the North Vietnamese broke contact and faded back into the jungle, according to their usual tactics, Tom Bennett had saved at least 5 men, 5 soldiers who would have bled out in that kill zone if Doc hadn't repeatedly exposed himself to heavy fire to reach them. The platoon had taken casualties, including killed in action, but it could have been so much worse. The difference between what happened and what could have happened was one skinny medic from West Virginia who kept running toward the sound of screaming. When night fell and the platoon established a defensive perimeter, Tom made his rounds, checking on the men who hadn't been wounded, making sure everyone was okay, that nobody was hiding an injury out of some misguided toughness. He re-bandaged the wounded men who were waiting for evacuation, gave them water, talked to them quietly, reassured them that the medevac choppers would come as soon as conditions allowed. He cleaned his medical supplies as best he could, restocked his aid bag from the reserves, prepared for the next day, because in Vietnam there was always a next day, and it was always just as dangerous as the last one. Only when his work was done did Tom allow himself to feel what had happened. His hands started shaking uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the aftermath of adrenaline. His legs felt weak, barely able to support him. He found a spot in the perimeter, sat down with his back against a tree, and tried to process what he'd just lived through. He had run through machine gun fire 5 times. Any one of those times could have killed him, should have killed him, by any reasonable calculation of probability. The fact that he was sitting here, alive and unscathed except for exhaustion and shock, seemed like a miracle. Tom pulled out his tape recorder, that little cassette machine he'd been using to send messages home when writing letters became too difficult in the field. His voice, when he spoke into it that night, was raw and exhausted, but also suffused with something like wonder. He described what had happened, trying to explain to his family what combat was like, what it felt like to run through gunfire, what it felt like to save a man's life while bullets were trying to take yours. He talked about his soldiers, about how proud he was of them, how brave they'd been, how well they'd fought. He talked about God, about feeling protected, about the inexplicable fact that he'd survived when by all rights he shouldn't have. "I feel that they can't hurt me in any way," he said into that tape recorder, words that would later seem prophetic or tragic depending on your perspective. "I've never been more confident, more sure of myself, and more at ease with myself." Around him, the jungle settled into its nighttime rhythms. The sounds of combat were replaced by the sounds of rain beginning to fall, of soldiers talking quietly, of radio chatter as the command network coordinated artillery and air support for the next day. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the North Vietnamese were regrouping, treating their own wounded, planning their next move. The battle wasn't over. It had just paused. Tom Bennett tried to sleep, knowing he needed rest, that tomorrow would bring more danger, more wounded soldiers needing his help. But sleep was hard to come by. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that kill zone again, saw the 3 soldiers who had fallen in the initial barrage, saw the faces of the men he'd saved. He thought about how close he'd come to dying, about the bullets that had missed him by inches, about the pure randomness of who lived and who died in combat. He thought about his mother back in Morgantown, about whether she was worrying about him, whether she knew that he'd been in a major firefight, whether she could sense across 8,000 miles that her son had faced death and survived. February 9th, 1969, was over. Tom Bennett had faced his first major test as a combat medic and had passed with flying colors. His platoon sergeant would indeed recommend him for the Silver Star. His soldiers would forever remember Doc Bennett's courage on that day, the way he kept coming back for them no matter what, the way he put their lives ahead of his own without hesitation or calculation. But the battle in the Chupa region wasn't finished. The North Vietnamese were still out there, and for Tom Bennett, 2 more days of hell were just beginning. War doesn't stop for exhaustion. It doesn't care that you've just been through the most terrifying experience of your life, that your nerves are shot, that your body is screaming for rest. In Vietnam, especially in the Central Highlands, where American units were constantly in contact with North Vietnamese regulars, one firefight often blended into the next, separated only by tense hours of waiting for the enemy to strike again. The night of February 9th was long and miserable for Bravo Company. The rain that had started as a drizzle turned into a downpour, that typical Central Highlands rain that came down in sheets, turning the ground to mud, soaking through every layer of clothing, making it impossible to stay warm or dry. The soldiers huddled in their fighting positions, weapons at the ready, trying to stay alert despite exhaustion, knowing that the NVA often attacked at night, trying to negate American advantages in air support and artillery by fighting at close quarters in the darkness. Tom Bennett spent that night moving from position to position, checking on his soldiers. Some were wounded men waiting for evacuation, and Tom had to monitor them constantly, making sure they stayed stable, that wounds didn't start bleeding again, that shock didn't set in. Others were healthy, but shaken by the day's combat, and Tom's presence, his calm reassurance, helped settle their nerves. Still others had minor injuries they hadn't mentioned during the fight, small wounds that needed cleaning and bandaging before they became infected in the tropical climate. The casualties who were most seriously wounded had been evacuated by helicopter during a brief lull in the fighting, lifted out in the cargo nets hanging beneath medevac choppers, those brave pilots willing to come in under fire to get wounded Americans to field hospitals where they'd have a fighting chance. But some wounded remained, men whose injuries weren't immediately life-threatening, but who still needed constant monitoring and care. Tom sat with them through the night, changing dressings, administering pain medication, talking quietly to keep their spirits up, making them believe they were going to make it home. In between his medical duties, Tom tried to rest, but rest was nearly impossible. Every sound in the jungle could be the enemy maneuvering for another attack. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves could mean North Vietnamese soldiers were closing in on the perimeter. The adrenaline from the firefight wouldn't completely leave his system, keeping him wired and alert even when his body desperately needed sleep. And his mind kept replaying the day's events, seeing over and over the wounded men he'd saved, the terrible wounds he'd treated, the chaos and terror of combat. In his letters and tapes home, Tom had written about fear, about being scared in Vietnam. But what he experienced that night was something beyond ordinary fear. It was the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from surviving something that should have killed you, combined with the knowledge that you have to do it all again tomorrow. It was the weight of responsibility for other men's lives, the awareness that your soldiers were depending on you absolutely, that any mistake you made could cost someone their life. It was the slow-motion trauma of processing what you'd seen and done, while knowing you couldn't afford to break down because there were still men who needed you. As dawn broke on February 10th, the second day of the battle, Bravo Company was still in contact with North Vietnamese forces. The enemy hadn't pulled back to their sanctuary areas across the border. They were still there in the jungle, still determined to inflict casualties on the Americans, still willing to trade their lives for American lives in the grinding war of attrition that characterized so much of the Vietnam conflict. Throughout February 10, there were sporadic contacts. Not the concentrated ambush of the previous day, but sudden bursts of gunfire, mortar rounds falling on the American positions, snipers taking shots at anyone who exposed themselves. It was nerve-wracking warfare, the kind that slowly ground down morale and eroded courage, where you never knew if the next moment would bring sudden violence or continued tense waiting. And with each contact, there were more casualties. A soldier hit by a sniper's bullet, another wounded by shrapnel from a mortar round. Tom Bennett responded to each call for the medic, moving through danger to reach wounded men, treating their injuries under fire, organizing evacuations when choppers could get in. His medical bag was getting depleted. He'd used most of his battle dressings, gone through his morphine syrettes, exhausted his supplies of IV fluid. Other soldiers shared their medical supplies with him, turning over first aid packets and extra bandages, anything that might help Doc save more lives. The physical toll on Tom was immense. He'd barely slept in 2 days. He'd barely eaten, grabbing a cold sea ration meal when he had a spare moment, forcing food down even though his stomach was in knots. He was dehydrated despite the rain, hadn't had time to properly fill his canteens and purify water. His uniform was caked with mud and other men's blood. His hands, usually steady, were developing a tremor from exhaustion and accumulated stress. But he kept going, because that's what medics do. Because his soldiers needed him. Because stopping, even for a moment, might mean someone died who could have been saved. Tom had discovered reserves of endurance he hadn't known he possessed, had found that he could function on almost no sleep, could push through exhaustion and fear and trauma to keep doing his job. His soldiers watched him with growing awe and respect. Doc wasn't just doing his duty. He was giving everything he had, pushing himself beyond reasonable limits, never complaining, never hesitating, always there when they needed him. The fact that he was a conscientious objector, that he'd opposed the war, that he'd never wanted to be in Vietnam in the first place, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that Doc Bennett was proving, day after day and hour after hour, that he cared more about their lives than he cared about his own. The platoon sergeant's recommendation for the Silver Star seemed inadequate now. What Doc was doing went beyond any single act of heroism. It was sustained courage over days, repeated exposure to danger, a complete disregard for his own safety in service of others. It was the kind of valor that the Medal of Honor was designed to recognize, though no one could have known that yet, though Tom himself would have been mortified by such talk. As February 10th wore on into another tense night, Tom made another recording to send home. His voice on this tape is noticeably more strained than previous recordings. The exhaustion is audible, the stress evident, but there's also determination, a sense that he's found his purpose and won't falter from it. He talks about his soldiers, about how much he's come to care about them, about how he'd do anything to bring them all home safely. He talks about the war, about how seeing combat up close has only reinforced his conviction that this conflict is wrong, that it's not worth what it's costing. But he also talks about duty, about how despite his opposition to the war, he's glad he's here, glad he can serve as a medic, glad he can save lives, even in the midst of all this death. That night, as rain continued to fall and the jungle pressed in around the defensive perimeter, Tom prayed. Not the formal prayers of his church upbringing, not the structured liturgy of Southern Baptist services. This was raw petition, desperate pleading with whatever force might be listening. Prayers for his soldiers' safety, prayers for strength to get through one more day, prayers for an end to this war, for peace, for a world where young men didn't have to kill each other in faraway jungles. Prayers that if he had to die here, it would at least mean something, that his death might save someone else's life. He didn't know those prayers would be answered the next day, though not in the way anyone would have wanted. February 11th, 1969, dawned grey and wet. Just another day in the endless cycle of patrols and contacts that defined the Vietnam War for infantry units. Bravo Company had survived 2 days of heavy fighting in the Chu-Pa region. They had taken casualties, but had also inflicted casualties on the enemy. The North Vietnamese forces that had ambushed them were still in the area, dug into fortified positions, waiting for another chance to engage the Americans. The orders came down. Bravo Company would assault those enemy positions. It was the kind of mission that every soldier dreaded, moving from defense to offense, attacking an enemy who had chosen the ground and prepared it, accepting casualties in order to clear the NVA from the area. But orders were orders, and in the early morning of February 11th, the soldiers of Bravo Company checked their weapons, adjusted their gear, and prepared to move out. Tom Bennett went through his own preparations. He inventoried what remained of his medical supplies, redistributed items in his aid bag for maximum efficiency, made sure he had quick access to tourniquets and pressure dressings because he knew he was going to need them. He checked on the soldiers in his platoon, made sure everyone was as ready as they could be, offered words of encouragement to men who were clearly scared about what was coming. The assault began, and within minutes, Bravo Company was heavily engaged with a numerically superior North Vietnamese force. The enemy had fortified their positions well, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach into a killing ground. American soldiers advanced by fire and maneuver, some laying down suppressing fire while others bounded forward to the next covered position, trying to close with the enemy despite the storm of bullets and shrapnel tearing through the jungle. 5 men fell wounded in the initial assault, cut down by enemy fire as they tried to advance. The familiar cries echoed across the battlefield. "Medic! Doc! We need Doc!" And Tom Bennett, who had somehow survived 2 days of this hell, who had saved so many men, who had pushed himself to the edge of what any human being could endure, grabbed his aid bag one more time and ran toward the sound of screaming. He reached the first wounded man, a soldier hit in the chest, blood bubbling from the wound. Tom worked with practiced efficiency, sealing the sucking chest wound, getting an airway established, preparing the man for evacuation. Bullets were hitting all around them, kicking up dirt, splintering trees, but Tom focused on his patient, on doing the job he'd trained for, on giving this soldier his best chance at survival. Then he heard another cry for help, farther forward, deeper into the kill zone. Another wounded man, this one isolated, cut off from help, lying in an area that was completely covered by enemy fire. Tom could see him, could see the soldier trying to drag himself to safety, wounded and vulnerable and about to die without medical help. The soldiers around Tom tried to warn him. "Doc, you can't reach him. It's impossible. They've got that whole area zeroed in." They weren't being cowardly. They were being realistic. That position was a death trap. Anyone who tried to reach it would be cut down before they made it halfway. It was simple battlefield math. Don't throw away 2 lives trying to save one that's probably already lost. But Tom Bennett wasn't thinking about battlefield math. He was thinking about the soldier lying out there bleeding, about a young American who was going to die alone in the mud if Doc didn't at least try to reach him. He was thinking about his oath as a medic, his duty to save lives, his responsibility to his brothers in arms. He was thinking about everything he believed, about the value of human life, about the imperative to help others, no matter the cost to yourself. He was warned that it was impossible to reach that position. He leaped forward anyway, with complete disregard for his own safety, trying to save his comrade's life. For Thomas Bennett, there was no choice. Someone needed help. Doc was going. The North Vietnamese gunners saw him running across open ground. They tracked him with their weapons, and they opened fire. Multiple weapons, multiple shooters, all focused on the American medic trying to reach the wounded soldier. The bullets found their mark. Tom Bennett was struck and fell, mortally wounded, dying almost instantly in that jungle clearing in the Chu-Pa region of Pleiku province. The soldier he was trying to reach would be rescued later. Other medics would arrive. The wounded man would survive and eventually go home. But Tom Bennett would not. At 21 years old, after just over a month in Vietnam, After 3 days of repeatedly risking his life to save others, Doc Bennett had given everything. He died on February 11th, 1969, without ever firing a shot in anger, without ever carrying a weapon into combat, without ever compromising the pacifist principles that had brought him to Vietnam as a conscientious objector rather than a rifleman. The men of Bravo Company were devastated. Doc Bennett had become, in a very short time, the heart of their unit. He was the one they trusted absolutely, the one whose courage had inspired them, the one who made them believe that someone cared whether they lived or died. And now he was gone, killed doing what he always did, running toward danger to help someone in need. The firefight continued, but the heart had gone out of it for Bravo Company. They eventually secured the area, drove off the North Vietnamese forces, accomplished their tactical objective, but the victory felt hollow. They had lost Doc, and to the soldiers who had watched Tom Bennett save lives over the previous 3 days, who had seen his repeated acts of selfless courage, his death wasn't just another casualty. It was the loss of something precious, something irreplaceable, something that represented the best of what a soldier could be. Tom's body was recovered and evacuated, beginning the long journey back to the United States, back to Morgantown, back to the family who had sent him off with love and worry and prayers that had not been answered in the way they had hoped. News of his death would reach home quickly, delivered by grim-faced officers in dress uniforms, reducing his mother and stepfather to grief that no words could adequately comfort. But even as the news of his death was being delivered, something else was happening. Tom's platoon sergeant, the officer who had wanted to put Tom in for the Silver Star after February 9th, now knew that a Silver Star wouldn't be enough. What Tom Bennett had done over those 3 days in February 1969 deserved the highest recognition his country could give. The paperwork would start immediately. Thomas William Bennett would be recommended for the Medal of Honor, posthumously, for his actions in the Chupa region, for repeatedly risking his life to save others, for his complete disregard for his own safety, for his extraordinary courage and selfless devotion to his fellow soldiers. The men of Bravo Company would be the ones who insisted on this recognition. They had watched Doc Bennett in action. They had seen what he'd done. They knew that what they'd witnessed was something beyond ordinary heroism, beyond mere duty. It was the kind of sacrifice that defined what the Medal of Honor was meant to recognize: gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Tom Bennett had gone to Vietnam believing the war was wrong. He had served anyway, out of duty and conscience, out of love for his country and his fellow soldiers. He had proven that you could oppose a war and still serve with honor, that you could refuse to kill and still die a hero's death. His 3 days in combat had compressed into a single brilliant display of everything that was best about the American spirit: courage, compassion, self-sacrifice, devotion to others above self. The jungle where he fell would continue the war without him. Other medics would take his place, other soldiers would face the same choices he had faced, but no one who had known Doc Bennett would forget him. And the letters and tapes he had sent home, preserved by his family, would ensure that his voice, his thoughts, his struggle to live according to his conscience would echo through the years, speaking to future generations about the cost of war and the courage it takes to remain true to yourself in the midst of chaos. February 11th, 1969, was Tom Bennett's last day on Earth, but it was also, in a very real sense, the beginning of his legacy. The Army telegram arrived at the Bennett Gray home in Morgantown on a cold February day in 1969. Western Union, official U.S. Army communication, the kind of envelope that every military family dreaded during the Vietnam War. Tom's mother, who had worried every day since her son deployed to Vietnam, who had prayed constantly for his safety, who had read and reread his letters and listened to his tapes over and over, knew what that telegram meant before she opened it. The Army regrets to inform you, Private First Class. Thomas William Bennett had been killed in action on February 11th in Pleiku Province, Republic of Vietnam, while attempting to provide medical assistance to a wounded soldier. The telegram was brief, official, deliberately unemotional. It couldn't capture what had actually happened, couldn't convey the courage or the sacrifice or the meaning of Tom's death. It was just data, name, rank, date of death, location. Another casualty of America's war in Southeast Asia. Grief descended on the Bennett Gray household like a heavy fog. Tom was gone. The boy who had climbed on the porch roof to avoid curfew after Bible study. The teenager who asked uncomfortable questions about loving your enemies. The college student who had founded the Campus Ecumenical Council. The young man who had gone to Vietnam as a conscientious objector, determined to serve without killing. All that potential, all that idealism, all that fierce commitment to living according to his principles ended in a jungle clearing 8,000 miles from home. His stepfather, Kermit Gray, the World War II veteran who had taught Tom about duty and honor and patriotism, was devastated. He had never wanted Tom to go to Vietnam. He had understood Tom's moral objections to the war, even if he didn't entirely agree with them. But he had also been proud that Tom chose to serve, that he found a way to honor both his conscience and his country. Now, his stepson was coming home in a flag-draped coffin, another young American sacrificed to a war that more and more Americans were questioning. Tom's brothers George and Jim struggled with their own grief. They had looked up to their younger brother, had been amazed by his intensity and his convictions, had sometimes been baffled by his choices, but had always loved him. Now they had to process the reality that Tom was gone, that there would be no more late-night conversations, no more passionate debates about theology and politics, no more letters from Vietnam describing his struggles and doubts and small triumphs. The funeral in Morgantown drew a crowd. Tom's classmates from West Virginia University came, friends from his church came, teachers who had known him came, some anti-war activists came, seeing in Tom's death both tragedy and vindication of their arguments that this war was consuming the best of America's youth. Some veterans came, men who had served in previous wars, who understood what it meant to die in uniform, even if you didn't believe in the cause you were dying for. The service tried to honor both sides of Tom Bennett, the pacifist and the soldier, the anti-war protester and the combat medic, the young man who hated violence and the hero who had died saving others. It wasn't easy to hold those contradictions together, to make sense of a life that seemed full of paradoxes. But that was Tom, complex and conflicted, never simple, never fitting neatly into anyone's categories. In the months after Tom's death, his platoon sergeant and company commander worked to ensure that his actions in Vietnam were properly recognized. They gathered statements from soldiers who had witnessed Tom's heroism, documented each act of courage, built the case for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation moved up through channels, battalion, brigade, division, to the Department of the Army, finally to the White House for presidential approval. Tom's mother initially didn't want the Medal of Honor. The very idea offended her. Her son had been a conscientious objector, someone who opposed war and violence. She knew Tom hadn't wanted medals or honors, that he told friends he didn't want to glorify the war by accepting military recognition. The Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, seemed like exactly the kind of glorification Tom would have rejected. She was prepared to refuse it on his behalf, to tell the army to keep their medal because Tom wouldn't have wanted it. But then she heard from the soldiers. Men from Bravo Company wrote to her, called her, visited her when they rotated back to the States. They told her about Doc Bennett, about what he'd meant to them, about how he'd saved their lives. They told her that the Medal of Honor wasn't really about honoring the war. It was about honoring Tom, about recognizing his courage and his sacrifice, about making sure that what he'd done wouldn't be forgotten. They told her that they needed this recognition, that for them, the soldiers who had served with Tom, the Medal of Honor was important, was meaningful, was a way of saying that Doc Bennett's death mattered. And Tom's mother relented. She agreed to accept the Medal of Honor on her son's behalf, because if the soldiers who had fought alongside Tom, who had been saved by him, who had witnessed his heroism firsthand, if they thought the medal was important, then she would accept it for them. The ceremony was scheduled for April 7th, 1970, exactly 1 year after Tom's death and what would have been his 23rd birthday. President Richard Nixon, mired in the Vietnam quagmire he had promised to end, would present the medal personally at the White House. It was the kind of event that should have been triumphant, celebratory, a chance for America to honor one of its heroes. But there was a bitter edge to the ceremony, an awareness that Tom Bennett had died in a war that Nixon himself was trying to wind down, that the young man being honored had opposed the conflict that killed him. Tom's family traveled to Washington. His mother, his stepfather, his brothers. Some of the soldiers from Bravo Company were there, men who had been saved by Doc Bennett, who were alive because of his courage. Friends from Morgantown made the trip. The ceremony was dignified and somber, with all the military protocol and precision that the Pentagon could muster. Nixon read the citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Corporal Tom Bennett distinguished himself while serving as a platoon medical aidman. The words documented what Tom had done, the repeated exposure to danger, the 5 men saved on February the 9th, the continued courage throughout February 10, the final selfless act on February 11th. The citation made it official. Thomas William Bennett was a hero, recognized by his nation for extraordinary valor. But what the citation couldn't capture, what no official document could really convey, was the complexity of Tom's service. He was the second conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. The first had been Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist who had served as a medic in World War II and had single-handedly saved 75 men at the Battle of Hacksaw Ridge. Tom Bennett and Desmond Doss represented something unusual in American military history. Men who refused to kill on religious grounds, but who were willing to die to save others. Men who demonstrated that courage wasn't synonymous with violence, that heroism could wear a pacifist's face. The Medal of Honor made Tom Bennett official military history. His name would be inscribed on memorials, included in lists of Medal of Honor recipients, taught about in military schools. Buildings and bridges would be named after him. At West Virginia University, a dormitory tower in the Evansdale residential complex would bear his name. A bridge, carrying Interstate 79 over the Monongahela River in Morgantown, would become the Thomas Bennett Memorial Bridge. Years later, medical clinics and youth centers would be named in his honor. But perhaps the most important memorial was one that couldn't be built out of stone or steel. The collection of letters and tapes that Tom had sent home from Vietnam, preserved by his family and eventually donated to the West Virginia and Regional History Center at WVU. These documents, these messages from a young man wrestling with conscience and duty in the midst of war, would become invaluable historical resources, windows into the lived experience of the Vietnam War and the moral struggles it provoked. His classmate and friend, Bonnie McCune, would eventually write a biography of Tom called Peaceful Patriot, The Story of Tom Bennett, published in 1980. The book would weave together Tom's letters, interviews with people who knew him, research into his life and times, creating a portrait of a complex young man who couldn't be reduced to simple hero worship or anti-war martyrdom. McKeown's book would reach readers on all sides of the Vietnam debate, allowing Tom to continue speaking across the years about what it means to serve with honor while opposing the cause you're serving. The Medal of Honor ceremony ended. The family returned to Morgantown. Life went on, as it always does, even in the shadow of such loss. But Tom Bennett's story was now part of American history, preserved not just in official records, but in the memories of the men whose lives he saved, in the tears of the family who loved him, in the letters that captured his voice and his struggle. The conscientious objector who went to war, the pacifist who earned the Medal of Honor, the young man who proved that you could stay true to yourself even in the midst of chaos and violence. His legacy would endure. More than 50 years have passed since Thomas Bennett died in the jungles of Vietnam, yet his letters remain startlingly immediate, alive with the voice of a young man grappling with questions that still resonate today. What do you do when your conscience conflicts with your duty? How do you serve a cause you don't believe in? Can you maintain your principles in the midst of war? Is it possible to love your country while opposing its actions? Tom's letters and tape recordings, preserved in the West Virginia and Regional History Center at West Virginia University, offer no easy answers to these questions. Instead, they document one person's struggle to navigate these impossibly difficult moral waters, showing both his strengths and his weaknesses, his moments of clarity and his periods of doubt. Reading them now, we see not a saint or a martyr, but a real person, flawed and complex, trying his best to do right in circumstances that made doing right almost impossibly hard. In his early letters from Fort Sam Houston during medic training, Tom wrote with a mix of enthusiasm and anxiety. He was learning valuable skills, gaining knowledge that could save lives, but he was also preparing for war, becoming part of a military machine designed to kill enemy soldiers. The contradiction troubled him deeply. God help a world where ordinary young men must become trained killers, he wrote after watching soldiers practice bayonet charges. Yet he never seriously considered backing out, never sought an exemption from deployment. He had made his choice and he would see it through. The letters from Vietnam are more complex, more emotionally raw. Tom wrote about the beauty of the Vietnamese landscape, the kindness of some Vietnamese people he encountered, the sense of being in a place utterly foreign to everything he'd known in West Virginia. But he also wrote about the ugliness of war, the casual cruelty he witnessed, the way combat brought out both the best and worst in people. He wrote about being scared, about lying awake at night wondering if tomorrow would be the day he died. He wrote about homesickness, so intense it was physical pain. But he also wrote about finding purpose. Despite all his doubts about the war, despite his moral objections to violence, Tom discovered that being a medic gave his life meaning in a way nothing else ever had. He was saving lives. His soldiers depended on him. He mattered, not as a cog in a vast military machine, but as an individual whose skills and courage made a direct, immediate difference in whether other individuals lived or died. That sense of purpose sustained him through the fear and exhaustion and moral ambiguity. One recurring theme in Tom's letters is his relationship with his soldiers. He wrote about them with obvious affection, with pride in their courage and resilience, with concern for their well-being. He worried about their feet, their health, their morale. He celebrated their small victories and mourned their losses, and he never judged them for fighting in a war he opposed. They were, in Tom's view, no more responsible for the war than he was. They were just young Americans doing what their country asked of them, and they deserved his care and respect, regardless of his personal views about the war's justness. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of Tom Bennett's legacy, his ability to oppose the war while supporting the warriors, to maintain his pacifist principles while serving alongside men whose job was to kill the enemy. He never wavered in his belief that the Vietnam War was wrong. He never stopped hoping it would end, but he also never stopped caring for the soldiers fighting it, never allowed his political convictions to interfere with his medical duties, never made any soldier feel judged or abandoned because of his opposition to the war. The letters also reveal Tom's evolving relationship with his faith. Before Vietnam, his Christianity had been idealistic, shaped by church teachings and Bible study, somewhat abstract despite his passionate engagement with it. In Vietnam, his faith was tested by reality, by senseless death, by suffering, by the apparent absence of divine intervention in the face of human evil. Some of Tom's letters from Vietnam question God's presence, wonder where divine providence is when good men are dying, struggle with the ancient problem of theodicy, trying to reconcile belief in a loving God with the horror of war. But Tom's faith didn't break. It changed, became more nuanced, lost its easy certainties but gained depth. He continued to pray, continued to read his Bible, continued to seek meaning in Scripture, even when that meaning seemed elusive. In one prayer that was later published, Tom asked God to shake him from apathy, to create in him discipline and love, to help him really live in spirit and truth. It was the prayer of someone whose faith was being refined by fire, stripped of comfort and convenience, reduced to its essential core. Perhaps the most poignant of Tom's surviving communications is his final tape recording, made just days before the battle that would kill him. His voice is tired, but also strangely confident. He talks about feeling that the enemy can't hurt him, that he's going to be okay. He tells his mother not to worry. He expresses satisfaction with who he is and what he's doing. Despite all these things, I can say in all honesty that I have never been more confident, more sure of myself, and more at ease with myself. That I like. And if this has to be, and I have to be here, I'm glad I'm a medic. Listening to that tape now, knowing what happened just a few days later, is heartbreaking. But it's also inspiring. Tom Bennett died, but he died at peace with himself, confident that he was living according to his values, glad that he had found a way to serve without compromising his principles. In the end, isn't that what we all hope for? To live authentically, to stay true to ourselves, to make choices we can be proud of even when those choices are hard? Tom achieved that, and his letters document the process of getting there. Comparing Tom Bennett to Desmond Doss, the World War II medic who was the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor, reveals both similarities and differences. Both men were deeply religious, motivated by sincere Christian faith to refuse to kill. Both served as combat medics, repeatedly risking their lives to save others. Both received the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism under fire. Both proved that pacifist convictions and military courage were not contradictory, that you could refuse to take life while being willing to give your own life to save others. But there were differences too. Doss served in World War II, a war that most Americans saw as clearly justified, as a fight against unambiguous evil. His conscientious objection was respected, if not always understood, because the war itself was supported. Tom served in Vietnam, a deeply unpopular and morally ambiguous war. His opposition to the war was widely shared, but his decision to serve as a medic put him at odds with much of the anti-war movement, which saw any cooperation with the military as complicity in an unjust war. Doss survived World War II and lived until 2006, long enough to see his story told in books and films, including the 2016 movie Hacksaw Ridge. Tom died in Vietnam at 21, his story known mainly to his family, his fellow soldiers, and those who have studied his letters and read Bonnie McKeown's biography. Doss had the opportunity to reflect on his service, to process his wartime experiences, to integrate them into a long life. Tom's story was cut short, frozen in time at the moment of his death, leaving us to imagine what he might have become, what he might have contributed if he had survived. The letters that Tom Bennett left behind matter because they complicate our understanding of the Vietnam War. We often think of that conflict in binary terms: hawks and doves, supporters and opponents, those who served and those who resisted. Tom Bennett doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. He was a dove who served, an opponent who put on the uniform, a pacifist who earned the Medal of Honor. His existence challenges easy narratives, forces us to acknowledge that real people are more complex than political categories can capture. They also matter because they document a particular kind of moral courage that's often overlooked. We celebrate physical courage, the willingness to face enemy fire, to charge machine gun nests, to stand and fight when every instinct says run. And Tom Bennett had that kind of courage in abundance. But he also had moral courage, the willingness to face criticism from both sides, to maintain unpopular convictions, to refuse to compromise his principles, even when doing so would have been easier and safer. That kind of courage, the courage to be who you are when the world wants you to be something else, is just as rare and just as valuable as the physical courage that wins medals. Tom's letters remind us that war is complicated, that good people can disagree about the right course of action, that doing the right thing isn't always clear or simple. They remind us that soldiers are individuals, not statistics, each with their own stories and struggles and reasons for serving. They remind us that faith can sustain people through terrible trials, but it doesn't provide easy answers or immunity from doubt. They remind us, most of all, that conscience matters, that staying true to yourself matters, that how you live your life matters even if that life is cut tragically short. More than 50 years after Tom Bennett's death, his voice still speaks through those letters and tapes. A new generation can discover his story, can grapple with the same questions he faced, can be inspired by his example of principled service and selfless courage. The conscientious objector who went to war, the pacifist who saved lives under fire, the young man from Morgantown who proved that heroism comes in many forms, his legacy endures not in marble and bronze but in paper and magnetic tape, in words written and spoken across an unbridgeable distance, in a voice that still has something to teach us about courage, conscience, and the cost of staying true to yourself. If you've made it this far in this journey, through Thomas Bennett's short life, you've traveled from the peaceful hills of Morgantown, West Virginia, to the killing fields of Pleiku Province, Vietnam. You followed a young man who tried to honor multiple loyalties simultaneously, to his God, to his country, to his conscience, to his fellow soldiers. You've watched him struggle with impossible questions about duty and morality, about service and sacrifice, about what it means to be a good person in a bad situation. Tom Bennett's story doesn't provide easy answers. It doesn't make you feel comfortable about war or peace, about patriotism or dissent, about the choices young people face when their country goes to war. If anything, it should make you uncomfortable, should force you to acknowledge that real moral situations are messy and complicated, that good people can make different choices and still be good people, that heroism comes in forms we don't always expect or understand. But Tom's story also provides inspiration, because in the midst of all that complexity and moral ambiguity, Tom Bennett stayed true to himself. He didn't take the easy way out. He didn't dodge the draft or flee to Canada. He didn't compromise his pacifist principles by carrying a weapon, but he also didn't abandon his country or his fellow soldiers. He found a way to serve that honored both his conscience and his commitment to others. It wasn't a perfect solution, because there are no perfect solutions in war. But it was his solution, authentically his, a reflection of who he was at his core. The letters Tom sent home from Vietnam are more than just historical documents. They're messages in bottles thrown into the ocean of time, washing up on shores he never imagined. They speak to anyone who has ever felt torn between competing loyalties, anyone who has had to make hard choices with no good options, anyone who has tried to maintain their principles in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy them. They speak across generations, across political divides, across the vast distance between the safe comfort of peace and the desperate chaos of war. Tom Bennett was 21 years old when he died. Think about what you were doing at 21, what you cared about, how seriously you took anything. Now imagine being responsible for other people's lives. Imagine being in a place where your decisions determined whether men lived or died. Imagine having to run toward danger again and again when your whole body was screaming at you to run away. Imagine doing all this while maintaining a moral position that put you at odds with almost everyone around you. That's what Tom Bennett did, and he did it with grace and courage and a kind of stubborn integrity that still amazes decades later. His Medal of Honor citation talks about conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Those are the formal words, the official language of military recognition, but the real story is simpler and more profound. Tom Bennett cared more about other people's lives than his own. When soldiers were wounded and everyone else was taking cover, Tom ran toward them. When he was warned that reaching a certain position was impossible, he tried anyway. When given the choice between safety and service, he chose service every single time, right up until the moment it killed him. We build memorials to people like Tom Bennett. We name buildings and bridges after them. We award medals and give speeches and try to honor their sacrifice. But the best way to honor them is to learn from them, to let their example challenge us, to ask ourselves if we're living up to the standards they set. Are we staying true to our own principles? Are we willing to serve others even when it's hard? Are we brave enough to be who we really are, regardless of what others might think? Tom Bennett's letters remind us that these questions matter, that how we answer them defines not just our individual lives, but the kind of society we create together. A society that remembers Tom Bennett, that takes his example seriously, is a society that values conscience alongside duty, that honors peaceful warriors alongside violent ones, that recognizes that there are many ways to be brave and many forms of heroism. As we close this exploration of Tom Bennett's life and letters, take a moment to consider what his story means for you. Maybe you're facing your own moral dilemma, your own hard choice between competing values. Maybe you're struggling to reconcile your beliefs with what the world demands from you. Maybe you're just trying to figure out who you are and how to live authentically in a complicated world. Tom Bennett's example won't tell you exactly what to do, but it might remind you that staying true to yourself is worth the cost, that serving others is its own reward, that even brief lives can cast long shadows if they're lived with integrity and courage. If you found value in this deep dive into Thomas Bennett's story, if these letters from Vietnam have moved you or challenged you or made you think, please hit that like button and subscribe to Whispering Wars. We tell the stories that need to be told, the stories that complicate our understanding of history, the stories of individuals who remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles, but about human beings trying to do their best in impossible circumstances. Share this video with someone who might need to hear Tom Bennett's story. Maybe they're struggling with questions of conscience and duty. Maybe they're a veteran dealing with the moral complexity of their own service. Maybe they're just someone who appreciates stories about courage and integrity, about people who stayed true to themselves no matter what. Tom's voice, preserved in those letters and tapes, deserves to be heard by as many people as possible. The jungle where Tom Bennett fell has long since grown back over the scars of battle. The firebase where he saved lives has returned to rainforest. The war that killed him has been over for decades, but his letters remain, and the questions they raise, the challenges they pose, the inspiration they provide, those are timeless. As long as young people face choices about service and conscience, as long as wars force impossible decisions, as long as we struggle to balance principle and pragmatism, Tom Bennett's story will have something to teach us. He was a peaceful patriot, a conscientious objector who earned the Medal of Honor, a young man from West Virginia who proved that you could refuse to kill and still die a hero. His letters are his legacy, his voice across the decades, his gift to all of us, trying to figure out how to live good lives in a complicated world. Listen to that voice. Learn from that example. And remember Doc Bennett, who ran toward the sound of screaming when everyone else was taking cover, who cared more about others than himself, who stayed true to his principles even in the midst of hell